Hey, my name is Alexis Mizels. I've been helping out with Wildfires to Wildflowers, and I wanted to invite Ildiko here to play lawn doctor at a new apartment that I just moved into. So I'm really curious to find out if there are any native species here and what I can do to start taking out what is invasive and restore some of the habitat.
So we're going to start off by talking about four categories of plants that I like to think of when diagnosing a landscape. So we have native plants. Those are plants that evolved in the place where they are growing. We have invasive plants. Those are plants that have been brought over that are from a similar climate but did not evolve in the place where they are growing and remain unchecked by local wildlife and predators. So they tend to take over, they invade. And then we have horticultural plants, which are plants that have been planted by gardeners to look pretty. And then we have agricultural plants. That would be like the fruit trees and the lettuces and the tomatoes and plants that we plant to eat. So what we'll do now is we'll walk through Alexis's garden and we'll look out for these different kinds of plants to begin to assess what our next moves might be in terms of enhancing the habitat in this little garden. This is pampas grass. So this is an invasive grass from Argentina. You'll notice that most of our invasive species come from places in the world where wine grows, because those are the Mediterranean climates. So this is a grass that thrives in coastal California. There's whole stretches of Highway 1 that are just blanketed with this pampas grass, and there's no other species living. So that's how invasive species over time decrease biodiversity. Nothing else can live because they're not eaten by other animals. Since they're not eaten and the native plants are eaten, they are able to outcompete the native plants. And then once they have taken over, there's no more food for the wildlife. So if you want more wildlife, you need more native plants. So that's why one of the first things we would do in this garden is we would start to take out the invasive species. This is one of them. You can touch it this way, but if I were to run my hand the opposite way on the blade, it would hurt. So when you take this grass out, you want to wear full protective gear, meaning long pants, long sleeves, and gloves. And you would chop it all the way down, and then you would have to dig out the root ball. If you don't dig out the root ball, the plant will come back. But I've done it before. I've taken out a pampas grass like 5 times the size of me, and it was so satisfying. It's a great way to release anger at your ex if you have it. So this is English ivy. This is an invasive plant that you see all over California. It tends to prefer moist shade. So the fact that it's here doing so well either tells me that there's usually more shade in this garden than what we're seeing now, or there's more moisture somehow in this garden than what you might be able to perceive. A really great way to remove this plant spreads through runners. It's also a vine, so it'll go, if there were a tree here, it would be going all the way up the tree. But it'll spread along the ground and it'll set roots. So this is, see those roots? It spreads, this runner goes along the ground and then it roots into the ground. So a good way to remove this plant is to sort of create a line of defense, and you start pulling it up and then you start rolling it. So you roll and you clip, and you roll and you clip, and when I say clip, I mean clipping these roots. And then if you have a few people doing it, Alexis lives with 5 other people, so you can imagine 5 people in this backyard rolling and clipping and rolling and clipping until you get to this area here, and you'd probably want to come in with some big loppers, some big clippers, or a saw, and get in and saw this down. In Alexis's entire backyard, we did find 2.5 native species. I say half because I'm not sure if the other one is native or not. And I'm going to show you 2 of those. So the first one is this bracken fern. This is a fern that Actually enjoys it can thrive in the sun, which is rare. Most ferns don't like the sun. And it spreads through rhizomes. So rhizomes are underground stems. That's a very important evolutionary advantage. It's an important adaptation because what this plant can do is it can survive underground in its rhizomes and then look for the nearest spot where there is light and nutrients for it, which I think is one reason why it's still here in spite of being pretty overtaken by invasive plants. So one of the other really great native plants that we found on Alexis's backyard is this right here. This is called manroot or wild cucumber. This is a deciduous vine, so it dies back in the summertime when there's no water, and then it re-sprouts again in the winter with the first rains. When it dies back, it is actually staying alive. The green part dies back, but under the ground, the reason why it's named manroot is it has a big, giant tuber that is the size of a man, or maybe a corpse. And it also, in the spring, gets these really amazing seed pods. So this pod is just forming itself. What'll happen is it'll dry, it'll turn brown, and it'll crack open from the bottom here, and inside there'll be large seeds, large smooth brown seeds about that big. After that happens, the plant will begin to die back. So it's actually covering this whole wall here too. It's thriving, it loves it back here. And it's similar to the bracken fern. The fact that it can store its energy in its big manroot in the summertime is an adaptation that keeps it alive in spite of all of the competition that it's experiencing back here. So we've done an assessment of Alexis's yard. We saw the major invasive species, we found a couple native species. The next step is to think, how can we enhance this backyard? What species would we want to plant? What native San Francisco species would we want to plant to start bringing back biodiversity and butterflies and birds and bees to this space? Alexis is really lucky because she lives close to the Presidio, which is one of San Francisco's major natural spaces. So what we can do at a later date is go to the Presidio and look at the plants that are around there and get inspiration for what might have been on this little plot of land hundreds of years ago, and what plants might have been there, and plant those plants.